Looking back now, I wish I hadn't said what I did that night. It was one of those arguments that felt pointless at the time, just the usual roommate tension, but it got out of hand fast. Ben and I had been living together for nearly 2 years, and while he kept to himself, we'd always gotten along. I'm not sure why I even brought it up. Maybe it was the stress at work or the fact that it was late with rent again, but I snapped, saying things I'd never said before, accusing him of being selfish, aloof, impossible to know. He didn't respond right away, just looked at me with this expression like he'd been waiting for the argument to happen. He muttered something about not needing people to understand him, but it just made me angrier, and that's when I said it. If you don't care, maybe you should just disappear. He gave me a long hard look, turned around, and left the apartment, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. I didn't know it at the time, but that was the last time I'd see him. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Ben was always up early, clanking around in the kitchen or pacing in the living room with his morning coffee. But that day, there was nothing, just silence. At first, I figured he'd just gone out early to blow off steam, but by the time evening rolled around, I hadn't heard a word from him. I texted, called, nothing. When another full day passed without a sign of him, I started to worry. By the third day, I was pacing the apartment, trying to think of where he could have gone. That's when I decided to check his room. Ben was usually a minimalist. His half of the apartment looked almost bare compared to my cluttered side. But stepping into his room, I noticed it was emptier than usual, like someone had stripped it down on purpose. His laptop was gone, a suitcase missing from the closet. It looked like he'd packed up and left. I glanced around, looking for anything that might explain where he went. And that's when I saw it. A sticky note on his dresser mirror. It was stuck there haphazardly, as if he'd left it in a rush. In his handwriting, it read one simple word, look. I stared at the note, my pulse picking up. Look, for what? I started searching the room, opening drawers, lifting the mattress, checking the closet shelves. I was just about to give up when I noticed a small folded piece of paper wedged between the pages of a book on his nightstand. On it, he'd scribbled a message that sent a shiver down my spine. I told you, there are things you wouldn't understand. But if you insist on knowing, start here. Where to start? He hadn't even given me a hint, just a piece of paper with an ominous message. I folded it up, feeling a mix of frustration and worry. This was just like him, always keeping things vague, as if revealing anything real about himself was a burden. As I searched more thoroughly, I found another slip of paper in his dresser. It had an address written on it, one I didn't recognize. There was no label, no clue what the address might be, but something told me it was important. My first thought was that maybe he'd gone there. Maybe it was a friend's place, or some kind of safe house he'd set up in advance. I debated whether to go, but my curiosity and the strange worry gnawing at me pushed me to find out. The address led me to a small, unmarked building in a part of town I'd never been to. It looked like it might have been a storage facility once, but now it was abandoned. I walked around the perimeter, feeling a strange sense of déjà vu, like I'd seen this place before, maybe in a dream or some long-lost memory. Eventually, I found an open door and stepped inside. The room was mostly empty except for a small metal locker in the far corner. It had a combination lock on it. My heart sank. Without the combination, I wouldn't get anywhere. Just as I was about to turn back, I noticed a faint scratch on the side of the locker, and on closer inspection, I realized it was a series of numbers lightly etched into the metal. 4271. I tried the numbers on the lock, and it clicked open. Inside the locker was a single item, a notebook, worn and weathered. I opened it, flipping through the pages, and immediately recognized Ben's handwriting. But the contents were nothing like I expected. Each page was filled with names, addresses, dates, all written in code, with strange symbols next to each entry. It looked like he'd been tracking something, but what? One page caught my eye. It was a list of initials and dates, going back years, but what unsettled me most was that the final entry had today's date, and next to it was written, meeting. Meeting with whom? And why hadn't he told me anything about it? I spent hours going through the notebook, trying to make sense of it. There were more addresses, some nearby and others in towns I'd never heard of. I began to wonder if Ben had been living some kind of double life, tracking people, visiting strange places and keeping records of it all. Back at the apartment, I found another sticky note, this time in the kitchen. It was stuck to the inside of the cabinet door, hidden behind the cereal boxes. It read, "You said you wanted to know. Meet me where we first met." Our first meeting had been at a small coffee shop on the edge of town. I almost laughed, remembering how random it had felt back then. Now standing there again, it didn't feel random at all. But when I got there, Ben wasn't waiting for me. Instead, the barista handed me an envelope, saying Ben had left it for me the day before. Inside was another note. "You were right about one thing. I am hiding something, but some things are better left hidden." At that point, my curiosity was clawing at me. Despite the strange fear that had been building since he disappeared, I had no choice but to keep going, to find out what exactly Ben had been hiding, even if I wasn't sure I'd like what I found. As I followed each lead Ben left behind, I pieced together fragments of his life. The addresses led me to people who knew him under a different name. They described a man who was always looking over his shoulder, never staying in one place too long. They told me stories of someone who was running, not just from people, but from himself. One last note in the envelope sent me back to our apartment, back to his room, where he'd left a final clue tucked into the pages of the book on his shelf. It was his confession. He'd been on the run for years, caught up in something he couldn't escape. And when he moved in with me, he'd been hoping for a fresh start, a chance to live normally. But whatever secrets he kept, they'd caught up with him. And now he had no choice but to disappear again. And as I read his final words, I realized that our last argument hadn't been a coincidence. Ben had planned it all. Every clue, every cryptic note, had been his way of saying goodbye. I was left alone in the apartment, surrounded by secrets I would never fully understand. Thanks so much for watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this story, and share your ideas for future videos. See you in the next video.